Welcome everybody. My name's Nathan Keast. I'm a development manager with TrackCare based out of Sydney. Today we're running through the automated, how to automate your coding standards and enforce that. Run through some technical portions of how you set that up. I had a question earlier about how do you really enforce coding standards? Do you need to put shock collars on developers? That's not in this session. That might be an idea for next year. So we'll run through just an overview of what can be done, what you need to do it, and then the means in which you use to do that, and look at some examples. So really what we're going to be able to do here is reformat code into something that you want to have a standard formatting pattern. Anything where you can identify the potential issues, you can throw warnings for or inform the developer about potential issues that could be coming along because of a pattern that has been identified. And if even more than that, you can recognize from a pattern what you would want the code to look like, then you can automate changing that code into the outcome that you're looking for. So, there's the different levels that you can enforce. So just quick run through so you understand what we're looking at here. So for TrackCare development, we still use Studio. If you're using Atelier, you can use Atelier to do these kinds of things. So take a quick look here. Obviously, with Cache Object Script, you have lots of different ways that you can write the code. So we have here some short form commands. We have some functions. We have some mixed case. We have some embedded SQL. And all of that is a bit choppy and not done consistently. So compiling that and just give Atelier a sec. The same thing that you can do from Atelier, you can do from VS Code or Studio. I'll show all of them. So this is the same code again. So having then compiled that, we can see that it's automatically being changed into, in this case, lowercase expanded commands for the commands, the functions. We've done a standard indent here. We've changed the SQL statements for the keywords there to be all uppercase, so you can have control over whatever your coding standard defines. You can automatically apply that. Same output there in Atelier, and then of course if you're looking at Studio, then you get the same knock-on effect there. So this one's actually linked up to the same document which was open in VS Code. So that's what I'm talking about, just making the code match however you want to define it. So the examples that we expanded here were the sets went from the S to the full word set, piece expanded, get. Where there was variations in case, we changed those to lowercase. We changed the spacing here to be consistent and have spaces after commas. We've got spaces either side of the operators. We've got the indentation based on the level. Note the indentation again on the embedded SQL. Here we have a JavaScript method, so different languages. It doesn't matter what the language is, as long as you define the rules of what your coding standards are, you can get in there and apply them automatically. So switch statement here with the different cases, jumping in terms of your indentation, in the same way you can control the commands and those kind of things there. So what are we trying to achieve here with the coding standards? Well, you can get a lot of benefit from having coding standards, but the first thing that you really need is the buy-in from the group that are writing the code, right? The people that are involved in it need to agree on what the coding standards are and that they're a good idea to start with. It doesn't matter what the standard is that they agree to, and as long as it's consistent across the group, then you get the benefit of being able to, anybody pick up any section of code, being able to read it, understand it more easily. You can share the knowledge of particular issues that are common failures within code. You get the knowledge going across the different parts of the group to be able to identify those potential issues and stop them early on. Then it's also helpful in terms of getting new people starting up. You know, they know what kind of code they should be writing. If you get somebody new that joins the team, they can see examples of what they should be writing. You enforce the standard across the whole application base. There's not somebody that learns on a particular section of the application which has a different standard and looks different, and they end up coding different to everybody else. So if you can apply standards, then you get a benefit in being able to share the knowledge across the entire group, and you just get a quicker pickup and a quicker turnaround in terms of developing the application and supporting the application. The way which we've implemented this, particularly with TrackCare, is using the source control hooks. It's a convenient point in the workflow of a developer to be able to interrogate the code and then provide feedback on that code. So you could do it at different stages. You can look at applying changes to your code base at build time. You can have it as an offline event nightly. But what we found that we really enjoy about using the source control hooks to do this is that when I type some code into Studio and then I compile it, I can see that outcome right away. If there's a potential issue that's been identified, I can resolve it then rather than waiting until later on, and get that immediate feedback. By driving through the source control hooks, you can also be linking to the area which has issues, or you see the output. What we get in terms of how the application of the coding standards goes in with your source control, it means that that developers submit actually includes the changes. So you can see what they've done as a step as part of the overall workflow. To be able to automate the standards, you need to be able to define them, right? So you have to know what the rules are. In knowing the rules, there might be some that are more vague, which are general principles of how you write the code. Those might not be able to be enforceable. If you're going to do something where you're automatically applying a change or identifying something where it deviates from the standards, then you've got to really be able to nail down what the standard is and what fits in and what doesn't fit in. If there's a maybe in there, then you're either just going to do a warning or do something where you say, hey, this might be an issue, but you can't really automatically take that and say that you want to change it to something else unless you really nail down any instance that meets this criteria is going to be looked at and changed to fit out with a different outcome. So some examples there are just simple things like casing, spacing, indentation. Things that are a bit more vague, identifying potential issues depending on how you do your debug or trace information. You might say that you can sometimes do these things, but this is a potential something that's been left behind or should come out of the code. Things like that are more vague. You can do warnings about, but you won't be able to automatically change it to the desired outcome unless you can define it. So how do we use source control hooks to apply these changes? Well, you can do it with whichever source control system you're using. The way that we've done it is that we write a new class that applies the coding standards, and it just inherits from your source control class. So you have your standard source control class, and you still maintain that in the same ways, and you have the extra bit that is doing the coding standards as a subclass of that. You could do it the other way around, but all you really need is the trigger event where you want to parse and update the code. So in this case, we are using the after save to be able to look at what has been changed in the document and then parse through and apply any changes that we want to do automatically. So there's a few different approaches to how you apply the changes and what you might do in terms of changing stuff within the code. So looking at a particular block of code, what do you want to do with it? For example, you may want to go down line by line and identify issues and change them. You may want to call an external tool that is going to do some parsing and give you some input. So in the case of JavaScript, there are many things that you can use to call and give you information back on that JavaScript to either apply standards or give you warnings, identify potential issues, or you may want to just do it by the word level down to this particular command or this particular function. And we'll take a look at each of those. Okay, so let's look at what we've got in terms of the actual source here. So this is my coding standards class. So as you note at the top here, we've inherited from source control Git in this case. It doesn't need to be linked to a source control class, but the events that are firing are coming from Studio with the source control hooks. So we have the environment set up to use the Studio extension code standards as the source control class. It fires all the Git source control events, and then it applies the extra layer of the coding standards which we've implemented in this class. What I've done here is just break down some of the options that are getting applied within here with different parameters. But at this stage, I just wanted to highlight the inheritance and then take a look at the one event that we need to implement here. So we're doing on after save. We're firstly taking the parameters that come in and calling the superclass, so it's still executing anything that would be executed as part of your source control events. Then secondly, moving on and doing a parse document. So within that, we have the parse document method here. First thing is looking at what type of document it is. So if we consider classes, for example, there are many parts where there are blocks of code within classes. So you have triggers or you have methods, as opposed to when you're looking at a routine and the entire document is a block of code. So that's the distinction that we make here. We call a different method just to parse down and run that because we know where we're pulling the code from. So here is how we're breaking down the class, and note we're going down each method, taking the implementation, and then sending that in to be parsed. So in the same way, when you look at the routine, it will just take the whole blob of code and pass that through. So looking at the options that you can do to apply the standards, one of the least amount of effort is to just hook up to an external tool. So if there is something else that is going to give you input in terms of warnings or doing formatting, then all you have to do is where you get a block of code, you parse that out, send that to a tool. It can be via command line or it can be via an API, and then read back in your results and replace the code on the way back in. Fairly straightforward. Some examples that you might want to do that with is, say, ESLint, which is a JavaScript parsing tool, and it'll tell you all the little things that it can identify. It'll tell you if you forget your semicolons, which I always do, and anything that it can figure out that might go wrong, it'll give you a shout about. So you can take those warnings and bring them back in and show them to the developer as soon as they've edited the document. So again, it's just helpful in being able to have that information available at the right time. You know, you'll get the details about something if you've put an error into it, but it might take you another 10 minutes when you get up to testing it or you're running through something else. If you can show that information to the developer when they've just typed in the code, then it's really quick to go and fix it straight away. Another example that I've put up here is HTML tidy. It's just looking at your HTML document and goes down and pulls it into some nice indenting makes it a little bit more readable. I really like being able to see code where it lines up properly so that I don't lose track of which things I've got open and which things I've got closed in terms of your open and closed tags, making sure that you have everything right. The easier it is to read, the easier it is to maintain, right? Then if you go a little bit further, then you have to write a bit more code. But what you can do is go down a block of code and just look at simple pattern matching, right? If there's anything that you can describe as a potential issue and you can put that into a pattern, then you can run down and identify that and alert the developer. So within track care development, we often have people, while they're developing, just setting globals so they can see what's going on in terms of debug information. So things like set debug mine equal $H, which is there so that you can figure out which part of the code it's got up to executing, but you don't want to leave it there. Like the last thing you want is to actually include that in the code base and accidentally submit it. So we alert whenever we find those things when developers are saving code. And that just means before they go to commit, they know they've got to clean that stuff up and get rid of it. TrackCare had a code base which has been built up over a long time, and there are patterns that you can identify now that haven't always been the best way to write things, right? So if you've been working with cache for a while, then you've recognized that things like the %session, %request, and result set objects have methods that have since been deprecated. They're still there and available to you so that no existing code base will break, but there's faster ways of doing it. So for example, if we consider the RS there as a result set, you can call getDataByName to get the value of a column. The faster way to do it is to do a $get and directly access the .data property on the result set. Now, because that is a controllable scenario and a recognizable pattern, we can just break up that line, change the code to use a $get around the data property instead of calling the getDataByName function. Now, on an individual line, that's not a big difference in terms of performance, but overall across the whole application, you do get gains just by making those little bits of performance gain. And then when you have other people coming in and developing, new developers coming in, then they're seeing the code the way it should be rather than the way that it was written originally. And then the last one I've got noted here is just a JavaScript example. So, as you go through and building up code bases, you recognize patterns where it might work for a particular browser, but there are reasons that you shouldn't be using a particular code or pattern, and you can put that in and either automatically change it to something else or make it an alert that people can then recognize that they've got to go back and try to resolve that issue. So that's doing line by line, essentially getting the string and just doing a pattern match on it. The next option is to break it down even further. This takes a little bit more coding, but it gives you more granular control. And so if you run it through a syntax parser, which is included with cache, or iris, then you can actually adapt at each case level. So you can adapt your functions, your commands, you can change your comments. But at this point, you're doing it per each command or different type of bit in the line. So we would have firstly the if statement there, then we would have the $get. We have the variable, which we're not going to do anything different with. We're going to keep the variables the same. And the set statement, and then the next variable, and then the function at the end. Running through that, you can apply your indentation, you can change your comment styles, you can do whatever you can actually imagine, as long as you can figure out a way to code it. So I've got a few examples in the prepared here that I'm going to run through just to show you the kinds of stuff that you can do with this. So here we have the parse class, so we're passing on the code stream. So here we're starting to look at the stream and recognizing what language it's using. This syntax color class breaks down the code stream into its parts. So given a whole block of code, it'll run through and it'll tell you what the particular command is, or whether it's a variable, a command, or anything else, what language it's in, and then what the value of that portion of the code is. So we're breaking that down, and then we're going on and parsing it for a particular command. So here I've got just a loop running down the whole bit, and to give a little bit of context to a command, I'm keeping track of what was the last one, what's the current one we're looking at, and then what's the next one coming. As you get to the end of the line, you get a /n to give you the new line. So let's take a look at line parsing here. So I'm checking firstly the indentation parameter at the top of the class to say whether I want to do any indentation changes or not. Then we're looking at what the indentation setting for this particular line is to apply that. So that first block there is really applying the indentation, which has been calculated based on the fragments included in that line. The next section here is looking at a different option. So this is where we're looking at the example of changing the get data by name into a $get of the result set.data. And so here we're looking to match the method that has been defined. We pull out the variable name by running through looking for characters or numbers that will be part of the result set name or %session or %request. And then we just change the code to match the $get of the variable $data. So the way we've implemented this class is that we have the converted line as an output. Then we come back up to the top. That's what we replace the block of code with. So that's the pattern match on the line-by-line kind of breakdown. This next method here is going through a fragment of a line. So we're looking at an if command, $class method, an object, a comment, anything like that. So again, we're breaking it down by language, so we know what language we're working with. The first option there is looking at whether it should be doing an indent change or not, and we're counting, okay, if it's cache object script, then brace is going to indicate that we want to do further indentation. A closed brace is going to indicate that we want to come out. So we are updating that current indentation. And then just a simple case here of a ## class, and we want to convert that to the cos case. So that's just doing z-convert to lowercase, returning that, and then that goes back in and updates the code. Same kind of thing for a couple of different constructs there, the &SQL, JavaScript, HTML. Where you get a little bit more tricky is where you're looking at, so here we're catering for the macros that might be included. And just checking off how they indent. So what we've put in is that if you're opening a macro, then it'll include a further indent on the next line. When you close out, it comes out, because those aren't using braces, right? So that's a different kind of thing to recognize. This is doing a comment conversion here, so you can have comments as a semicolon, you can have your macro comments, you can have your double slashes. Whichever way you would prefer, you can have that converted automatically. Once you've got it all hooked up that it converts it automatically, then it doesn't matter whether I write it with semicolons or double slashes, it's going to change it to what the standard is as soon as I save it, right? And then here's an example of just doing the case on any of the functions. So it's the same kind of thing that you can do with Cache Studio. And if you select your code and you say view expand commands, then it opens them all up. But we're just automating that process, including it in the background in your everyday processing so people don't have to think about it. And then a little bit more here, it's getting down to the pedantic level, but to do spacing next to your operators. So do you want to have variable equals value, or do you want to have a space either side of the equals operator? And you can do it either way, right? You can crunch it down if you want to keep the code compact. If you want to expand it out and prefer that way, then you can expand it out. It's all about what the development group or the people responsible for the code agree to in terms of standards and having it the same for everybody. So that's roughly how you do the fragmented part. I just want to take you back up a little bit and show you how you implement the HTML side of it, which is an external tool. So we have here just an example HTML page, nothing particular tricky about it. And as I save that, so that's jumped out, called HTML tidy, put in a standard doc type header, and then done the indentation down the HTML, which for me makes it a lot easier to read. So the example of that here in the code is in parse HTML. So at this point, it is just streaming out to a temporary file and then calling out to a command, which I've defined up here. So I've got HTML tidy executing as a command line that goes into another file, which then I stream back in. So I bring the output from HTML tidy back into the document, update. Depending on the tool that you're using, you might be able to have it edit in place, or you might have to stream to another temporary file and pull it back in. But either way, you get the outcome. So this is something that we found helpful for us in terms of managing the large code base with TrackCare. It's something that InterSystems is using for internal tools to be able to help keep some consistency across the application bases. And what we'd hope is that if you find it helpful, that it can help you guys really do the same and drive benefit. You know, I think coding standards is a concept that if you are there and applying them, then this is going to be helpful to just tie that in line. It saves development time in terms of people don't have to fuss about getting it exactly right. If the machine can do it for you, then they don't have to bother. And then I think that is about it. So, you know, again, I just want to reiterate that, you know, you can do whichever kind of level suits you in terms of your application. If you just want to do a little bit of beautification, no worries, you know, have a go. You can do warnings where you still want to leave the developer in control of the code itself and don't change it automatically. Just bring their attention to it. So, when you're going through, or when the source control hooks are executing, you can just write straight out and that comes up in your output window. If you write it out with the format of the class name and the line number, then when they double click that, they go straight to that line to say that's where the issue is. So the warnings can be really helpful. And then automatically resolving anything that you can automatically resolve even better. So within track care, we use all of these levels. We have different bits that we just alert warnings about because we don't necessarily know what the solution is. We want a developer to think about it and say, yes, this is right, or no, I'm going to do it differently, but how they're going to do it, they've got to figure it out. And then there's the ones where we know exactly what the outcome should be. It should look like this. We know this pattern, and we do that automatically. So it's not tedious that we're saying, hey, you should change this, and that they always have to go and change it to exactly the same way. So, any questions?
You mentioned that you can run it as a scheduled job.
Yep. So if you wanted to do it like nightly, then you would essentially just be setting up a task to run in Cache, either out of your code base or working to a workspace, right? So you would have an environment, probably on a server, where you have a workspace set up with your source control pulling down, and it might be at the end of a build or in the process of loading the code into do a build, run through, and at that point you would do your parsing. And if you want to then push it back into the source control, you do your manipulations, and then you recommit, and then you see that update in a separate job. It's a good question because the other part that I kind of skipped over a little bit is when you're doing this automation, if you're going to apply some coding standards that haven't been applied across the whole code base up until that point, then you probably want to do a little bit of this kind of thing first so that you get everywhere has the one change which shows this is bringing into line the coding standards, so that next time you have somebody go in and edit that document and they change one line, it doesn't look like they've changed 70 lines. You know what I mean? It abstracts the change that they have made from the coding standards change, if you can do that just baseline update.
I'm surprised to see you doing it after the superclasses processing and beyond after save, because if that's the stage in which it's getting committed into the source control, effectively you're saying commit the bad code into source control and then clean it up.
Yeah, so the question was whether it should be, the processing should happen before or after the source control, and you could do it beforehand. What I'm doing in this one is it probably needs to be upside down. I think I'm re-exporting it again afterwards, which is not as efficient as applying it first and then letting the source control do the export to the workspace. So it's not getting committed at that point, but it is doing the export to the workspace. Yeah. Anybody doing some form of automatic formatting or coding standard application at the moment? No? You're doing a little bit?
We have some of the things, but we have not reused any of these features.
Okay.
What we do is we have the studio hooks. So what it does is, whenever we have a workspace set up where all the files are as an XML.
Yep.
And then we run like a nightly job or something, parse those XML, check for a couple of things. So it's kind of
Cool. Cool.
for example, we do like lot work with the some cases, and that's the team I manage. So we check like specifically, for example, if they're in hardcoded path for the file path, they should not be there like TCP, IP imports.
Yep.
Should not be hardcoded. Those kind of things. We also check for like settings for the business operation and the process, which are standard. We want always they stay connected to the like 86,400. We want equals to be always set up with, if there's an error, chip disable, like a couple other things.
Yeah, some really good examples of like making sure that you don't have hard-coded IPs or ports or things that have been left in there. Anything that you can automate the identification of saves you time down the line, right?
You showed at the beginning, well, I was a few minutes late, but one of your screenshots was VS Code doing this. What are you using in the way, how are you connecting that into your environment? Are you literally just editing the local files in your...
So it edits the local files, but it's connected to the environment. There's an add-on for VS Code which lets you do cache object script. Yep. Yep, so that's what I was using. And then as it executes on the server, it still runs the Studio hooks. So it's run the same stuff that I was doing with Studio there.
Connected to that, the percent syntax color one, is that cross-platform? Is that Windows only?
So the comment is it's Windows only. It is shipped on Linux at the moment, so it does run on Linux.
It's a DLL.
Yeah.
It does run on Linux?
Yep. So the comment says that it's only available on Windows, so it might not always be there, but so I've run it myself on Linux stuff and had it work, yeah.
The examples that you demoed, are they available anywhere?
Yeah, so this source code will be up on the InterSystems GitHub, so you can download and play for yourself. Please do. If there's anything that you have questions about, please give me a shout, Nathan Keast. I can sort you out. If there's anything, then this is Ben Speed at the front here. He's been working with the internal apps at InterSystems for a long time and is familiar with a lot of it as well, if you can't get hold of me.
So you mentioned that this is available in GitHub, so it sounds like I don't even have to wait for the ISO. I can use it on cache.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're using this at the moment. We've been slowly building up this over the last 5, 6 years with track care. Yeah. All right. Any other questions? If there is anything, then find me over lunch. I'd be happy to discuss it. As I say, this is what we've been building up in track care just to make our lives easier, to automate the simple things, and so we can focus on what really matters. Yeah.
One question. The warnings and the code format that you're describing here, or especially the warnings in Studio, can that be something that is interactive as you're typing, or does it only happen on the save method when you do that? Similar to what you see like in
Yeah. So in this, it's only happening on the save because it's requiring that event to trigger the pars, right? Yeah, so I'm only doing it on the save. And you can, like if you find that you've got a lot of processing in there, or you're going to an external tool that is going to take a while, maybe you don't want to do it on the save, maybe you want to do it on compile, but you've got those source control hooks to decide which event you're going to use to do that. Okay, thank you very much, everybody.